Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Patricia Cervantes, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of a Sextech startup called Vibio. And we build app-controlled sex toys, which is a fun job in many ways. But in others, it's pretty much like any other startup experience. Where are the Sextech unicorns? Is something that me and my co-founder asked ourselves when we started Vibio in 2018. And as you know, every startup faces challenges, but being in sex tech comes with challenges that you might not expect. We're all familiar with those 1 billion valuation tech companies. There are over 300 in the world, and you can probably name more than a few of them. From sex toys to sex ed platforms to health apps, sex tech is a pretty wide industry. In fact, the sex tech and sexual wellness market is valued at around 80 billion US dollars and is predicted to hit 120 billion by 2030. Unless you're a sex tech geek, as I am, very few of you might have heard about who's at the forefront of the industry. And there are not that many new big players that are focused on tech. Yet, we've all heard sex sells, and sex is everywhere. We see sexually suggestive images every day in social media, in films, and in advertising too. And yes, sex is used to sell. But unfortunately, if your industry is in any way related to sexuality, you can't really advertise as freely as other products or services. Meta, Google, and most other advertising platforms have strict policies restricting how sexual health products and services are marketed. And this can be pretty unpredictable, to say the least. Let's take Google as an example. It has no restrictions for sex toy ads on search. So here, for example, you can see Lelo, which is a sex toy company based in the US, advertising one of their toys in the UK. However, that doesn't seem to have stopped them putting our Google Ads account on hold before we even had the chance to launch our campaign. This happened 2 weeks ago. We reached out, tried to get it back on, but they refused without further explanation. And this is something we experience often. Companies like Vibio, social media accounts are closed for seemingly no reason. This happened to us very early in our journey, even pre-launch. Even if we carefully monitor what we post to make sure that we don't infringe any rules. Posts related to sexual wellness are taken down from Instagram for soliciting adult services, but we all know the platform is full of sexually suggestive images and thirst traps. So there is a clear bias, and it's not only us who have noticed. In January of 2022, Center for Intimate Justice published a report describing Facebook's censorship of sexual health and wellness ads for women and people of diverse genders. And they found that 60 houses studied, all of them had experienced Facebook rejecting an ad at some point, citing policies on adult products and services, us included. Meta's policies ban content on sex toys, sexual enhancement products, and sexually oriented adult products, and put them in the same category as images of child nudity. In theory, products such as lubricants or condoms, which do not focus on sexual pleasure, are allowed. So enjoyment seems to be the problem here. However, we know this is not the case in practice, especially when this content or products or services are targeted to women and queer folks. Let's dive into some examples. Here we have some ads rejected by Facebook for VFit, which is a product made by Joylux that is used to strengthen the pelvic floor. This is a medical issue. In fact, 1/3 of all women and 50% of women over the age of 55 are currently affected by a pelvic floor disorder. But Facebook thinks this is inappropriate, and the ads were rejected. These are ads for Intimate Rose, which is a company that sells vaginal dilators and pelvic floor weights. Again, even though the presentation is pretty clinical, And it's clear that this is a health issue over a pleasure issue. Thanks for the advocacy of the Center for Intimate Justice and their report, Meta very recently changed their restrictions in 2023 to allow ads for birth control products, including condoms, family planning, and reproductive health products or services, which is great. It's a step forward. But unluckily for me and other companies like mine, content or products that focus on sexual pleasure are still not allowed, despite Meta having allowed in the past ads that emphasize male pleasure. This is a clear example. You can't see it because you have my face on top of it, but one of these ads was allowed to run. Which one do you think that was? One has a focus on education, the other one is purely sexual. One has suggestive imagery, the other doesn't. But Facebook thought the one on the left was more appropriate than the one on the right. This is another one. It's erectile dysfunction pills promoted with sexual innuendos and eggplant emojis on the left. Meta was happy to promote it. A post of a sex ed platform promoting consent, that was considered obscene and not allowed to run. This next one, it's a Durex ad, the famous condom company. You probably all know it. It's promoting a video on what turns boys on. No problem running that, even though it's a clear sexual topic. Now, we have this ad on the right, and can you spot what's being promoted? It's very discreet, but that ring is also a sex toy. But even though you can't really tell unless you know the company, that ad wasn't allowed to run either. We have another example here. You might have heard of Manscaped. Both ads here refer to genitals. We save balls, play like never before. But the one on the right is not allowed to run, while the one on the left is. You get the idea. There is a double standard. And the truth is, positive depictions equal access to public spaces. But what is deemed acceptable, possible, or appropriate is very different for some. Sextech is one of the few industries with women around, and I don't think that's by chance. Most of us in the industry joined because we have a shared mission, which is to help people live more fulfilled lives and empower them to make choices about their sexual health. But most of all, to normalize sex, because we don't want future generations to experience the taboos and stigma that we all experienced growing up, either feeling ashamed or lacking access to health, to sexual health and sex education. And sexual health and pleasure are an important part of our lives, and we can't keep treating them as spies. 84% of adults now consider masturbation a form of self-care. 163 million American adults own sex toys. And it's not all about having a good time, even though that's fine. People care about sexual wellness. Just between 2018 and 2021, there was a 600% increase in Twitter mentions for the term sexual wellness. In a world where sexual freedoms like access to abortion and comprehensive sex education are under attack, we can't afford to put brakes on sex tech. The truth is, people need our products and services for health, but also for pleasure. These policies and double significant challenges for businesses like ours, hindering our ability to grow, reach a wider audience. A company doesn't need unicorn status to be successful. That's not what I'm arguing for. But the fact that they're so rare in sex tech points to a larger issue with big tech. We're making progress, but there is still a long way to go to normalize sex and make sex tech mainstream. So, it's really good to be here talking about Sextech on a mainstream platform along other startups with other industries, because it's important to get the word out. And, sex is business, and sex is pleasure, and sex is health. So thank you so much for listening. Happy to answer any questions you have about advertising, but about Sextech in general as well.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me. All good, tech-wise,
Yeah.
that were? Good. People, please send your questions in. Still at insight.votamo.eu. You can still send questions in. I would straight up ask, so the situation is bad in a sense. Do you have any solutions, any steps that should be taken to perhaps make this issue less of an issue and to solve it perhaps?
Yeah, it's a hard one because adult restrictions are everywhere. It's not only about advertising in big tech, but it's also financial institutions. So even when we started our business, opening a bank account in the UK was a bit of a challenge. Some banks had restrictions on the types of businesses that can open bank accounts. And some of the adult restrictions from these banks prevented us from opening an account. So it took us more than a month to find a bank that would actually take our business, which is crazy to think about and something that we didn't know when we started our journey. And then there's access to funding from institutional investors. People are a little bit afraid of having sex on their portfolio. So I think there's a wider societal issue, but reports like the one that Center for Intimate Justice did last year, things like that really help in raising awareness and showing the double standard that we have. And hopefully with, initiatives like that and people in the industry making some noise, and also customers realizing the issues that we face, I think if we raise awareness as a society, things will slowly change. But it is a difficult issue to handle for sure.
Yeah, I can definitely see this interest in the topic because we have so many people here for this theme, to be honest. And you were talking about the bank account earlier as well. The presenter that was on stage before you as well, the first thing she talked about was how difficult it was to start a bank account dealing with Sextech.
Yeah.
But a question is, what can or should big companies do to help us get Sextech normalized?
Companies, so suppliers, providers, be open to working with us. In terms of the sales aspect of it, again, we need more marketing agencies and specialists that know how to work with companies like ours, who understand the restrictions. People in big tech, if you work for big tech, be an advocate for sex tech companies or, other companies that are affected by these restrictions. Because it's not only sex tech, to be honest. There's also a racial bias. So some companies or NGOs that work with, racial minorities, they also face issues with advertising. So it's not only sex tech, but if you work in the industry, if you work in the financial industry, if you work in investment, if you work in marketing, make sure that you do whatever you can in your industry to raise awareness and change things little by little.
Okay. I turned my mic off. I think I turned my mic off. Well done me. But from another viewer, absolutely loved your insights. Thank you very much. How do you strategize your communication with your customers' community?
I think it's important to be very conscious about the type of language that we use in our industry. And I think one of the clear differentiators that we newer companies, women-owned companies have, and queer-owned companies have, is to change the way that sex is sold. There is, if you go to a mainstream, like an old school kind of sex, retailer, and you want to buy a sex toy, probably the kind of language that you encounter. It's not the kind of language that you would expect for 2023. In terms of inclusivity, in terms of the way you talk about sex in a more natural way, in a fun way, but also, as you would talk about anything else. And I think that type of language, and also doing education with your content, I think that's what really speaks to customers nowadays, especially if you're targeting a younger demographic, which we are. We target Gen Z and early millennials. So that's something that really resonates, and something that is needed, to be honest, because right now, people need toys, but where the gap really is, where the problem, where the pain point really is with education, with removing that feeling of stigma and shame. So I think in order to thrive and build a community, companies like mine need to really pay attention to that aspect.
A good follow-up question to this is, how does one tackle the Sextech development on markets with strong religious influence, for example, countries with abortion bans?
Yeah, so it's funny because even in areas where people are very socially conservative, sex toys are still sold in large numbers. Texas is a great market for sex toys, but obviously in terms of their politics, things are a little bit different. So there is definitely a double standard, and I think in those areas, sex is kept under the rug, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So it's more of an education issue, trying to bring that from the deep to the surface, and making people more comfortable, not only talking about that, but comfortable talking about that with themselves. That is the challenge. Selling, no, that's no problem.
So it's more about communication than anything else, yeah? Okay, but
Yeah.
it has become common for Instagram meme pages, etc., to do collaboration with sex tech companies to promote their products. How to react to this?
I think it's great. I think we work in a space where not all influencers are able or willing to work with us. Some people have a certain persona that, if they were to be promoting sex products, that might clash with the vision that their audience has about them. And I think that's unfair. And I think that's a societal issue. We've had some influencers, that like our brand, who would love to work with us, but they also acknowledge, hey, this might be a problem for me in terms of my audience, my brand. So that's also something that we need to change as a society. How we see people who talk about sex in public, how we see sex businesses, how we see sex workers. So the sex industry in general, from tech to pleasure, everything. That's for us to change as well.
So, as I gather, because this was a bit focused on advertising as well, for example, then we basically need a bigger societal movement about sex positivity and understanding about that more before actually, things like advertising and so on can catch up. Is that the way forward then?
I think it's a two-way street. So for advertising to be more accepted, people need to change, but also people need to change through advertising. So if we have influencers that are not used to talk about sex, are maybe not in the sex space necessarily, but they talk about sex in a natural way, then I think that encourages people to also feel more comfortable with sex themselves. And that's something that I've seen time and time again in interpersonal relations. So once you start the conversation, and once you show that you're open and that you don't have any sort of taboos or stigma with that, I think people feel that, and that also helps them to be freer themselves. So there's something that we can do more in an institutional way or like a big scale, but even yourself talking to someone about sex in a natural way, that also creates change. I think it's almost more important.
Okay. Yeah, because I was asking the performer before as well about the sort of shame about talking about sex. Because, like, do you feel as well that there's this sort of certain wall between you and whoever you're talking to that you have to pass through, and this wall is mainly made out of shame? Is how could you tackle that? Is it just that you try and be open about it, or are there any other tips about communicating this through this wall?
Yeah, I I guess I had to break through that wall myself. I wasn't always comfortable talking about sex, and I think that is part of the problem. Then I realized there was, and the reason why I decided to work on Sextech. And it is a journey. At first, it's challenging, but the more you do it, the easier it comes. And right now, for me, talking about sex, or like even in an audience, a business audience, that for me, it's not something that I find challenging anymore, because I see it as something not normal. And so I think it takes a little bit of effort, but like anything, you get used to it and you come to enjoy it.
Yeah, I can understand that, because being on stage as well here, currently talking to you as well, if I didn't have a podcast where I talked about sex as well, I'd probably be a bit more blushing and so on. So I do understand that it is, I guess society just needs to talk about it a bit more and understand that stuff. So, but thank you very much for your time.